So, Matt, before we get to the content of that interview with Boris Johnson, just explain, if anybody doesn't already know, why he's out and about doing a range of interviews now, and perhaps more importantly, why you thought it was worth doing an interview with him.
Yeah, that's a good point. So he's got a book out, which
he only mentioned about 24 times.
He managed to. So although the interview was on my 5 Live show, it was also on the news channel, BBC News channel. And the first thing he did when he came in was manoeuvre the book so it was in shot on the news channel, and attempts to get him to desist from that failed. Why did I think it was worth interviewing him? And I've had so much of that on social media. Why are you giving this guy a platform? He's, whatever the adjective is or the noun, he's a former Prime Minister, he's left in disgrace, he's a liar, he's a charlatan, whatever the criticism that some people might have of him. And the truth is, he's a former Prime Minister. And he does have, I find former people much more interesting than current ones. Former Prime Ministers, former Chancellors, former Home Secretaries, because they have the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of just sitting and taking a breath and saying, do you know what, actually, that was a real mistake. At the time, I felt very passionate about that, but it was a mistake. So, we tried doing that. When a new thing comes around, a former person saying, look, we tried doing that. We tried that 3 different ways. It doesn't work.
It's like the shackles are off, right?
Exactly.
The restraints
and they're
are
sort
off.
of, they're more like normal people. They haven't got a line to take and all that. So in that sense, I always think of former Prime Minister. And I've interviewed, in fact, David Cameron a couple of times, Tony Blair, about their time in office, but with the benefit of sort of looking back. So in that sense, I just always think it's interesting. I think because he clearly still sees himself as being a player in politics without ever committing to wanting to come back, it's sort of slightly harder to get to that stuff. And because passions run so high with him, and you feel like you've got to do Partygate and COVID and Brexit and all that sort of stuff, there's not a lot of space left to do I said this to him in the interview, the bit in the book about doing PMQs is a genuinely interesting insight. There aren't that many people who've stood at the dispatch box and done PMQs, slightly more in recent history than in the past. And so the guide to what it's like in there and the process he went through each week to try and answer the question while he can't really hear and the noise and abuse, that is I find that just genuinely interesting. So I think it is interesting to hear from someone like that. Also, the manner in which he left office abruptly, with lots of people feeling, he wasn't held to account on some of the things that we discussed, it was just worth having him in. And if you get the opportunity, why wouldn't you?
We're going to get into the substance of all of it in just a sec. And Chris, I'm keen to pick your brains on all of that. But before we do, just a quick one, Matt. I always get the sense that when you watch or listen to these interviews as a kind of viewer or listener, like most people do and like I did in this one, you don't necessarily get all of those kind of the sense that you might have got when you're sitting across the desk from him in the room, like the body language, the composure, the demeanour. Like, what was your sense of him?
He didn't like me asking, are you a liar? I think that was quite clear, which he wouldn't. But it was a question that lots of listeners were putting. I have to say, if we did a textual analysis of all of the messages, there is one word that comes up. It begins with L. Do you want to guess what it is?
Let me see. Go on.
It's liar. Lots of people think you're a liar.
Well,
are you a liar?
I know, and I think that if whether it's the bus, which in fact was the bus of truth, or
this is the 350,000,
yes,
350 million.
350 million.
You admit in your book that was wrong.
No, I don't.
You do?
I say that it was in fact an underestimate, because it was going to probably rise
no,
to...
You don't. You say in the book that the real figure,
I
figure is much lower.
No, sorry, I'm not going to have all this rubbish.
I've read your book.
Well, then
and you say it was more like 170 million.
Reflect properly. No, that is the net figure that the UK was sending to Brussels to be spent by the EU on projects in the EU. That the rest was to be spent by the EU on projects in the UK with no control from the UK, right?
Yeah.
So that was why.
Let's not get too.
No, come on. Come on. You see, that's the problem. You accuse me of being a liar. And then when I actually come back with the truth, you don't want to hear it. And the truth is that those numbers were going to go up.
I think he likes I think part of the reason why he didn't like PMQs is it's a battle not on his terms. And he's an incredible public speaker. He would turn up to Tory party conferences when he wasn't Prime Minister and electrify the thing, because he was much better at being funny and engaging and entertaining and all that. But that's very much on his terms. And I think when he was going on about, well, we'll come to it a bit, but when I pushed back on some of the things, he clearly didn't like that, because he wanted to plug the book. And maybe he thought that if he was doing 5 Live in the afternoons, maybe he thought it was going to be a bit more fun and lighter. And if he'd come on for an hour, which is what we offered, we might have got onto a bit of that. But actually, and I think I maybe sometimes doing those interviews, because there's lots of things, isn't there? You want it to be good radio. You want to hit the marks that people expect you to hit. But you don't want to over worry about that, because he has been asked about all those other things already. And the balance between, and then there's, news lines. Journalists want news lines. Oh, you had half an hour with him, you didn't get a news line. That's always sort of at the back of your mind as a journalist. But you don't want to there's nothing worse than an interview which is just grinding out news lines. So I wanted it to feel like we were having a boisterous conversation rather than working through a series of news lines.
And tell us how you've approached the last few days in preparing, given that here's a guy who has got a book out and he's on a bit of a studio tour at the moment, and he's done quite a few already.
Well, fortunately, I had a cold at the weekend. And I felt really rough. So
not many people say that's fortunate.
No, it meant that I quite happily stayed in all weekend and read his book in a way that even some of the other people who've interviewed him over the last few days have admitted they hadn't read the book, partly because they didn't let us have it till Thursday, because it was being serialised by a newspaper and they only let us have it, although even though it's not out till next week. But anyway, so I actually read the book, which helped. And in the reading of it, I started... You get swept along by his sort of optimistic boosterism, which is obviously part of his sort of political appeal. But then this recurring pattern of, and then something went wrong because he hadn't read the report, or because he said something that turned out not to be quite right. And you can sort of, it's a sort of catalogue of kicking himself. That's the thing. So then sort of trying to, weirdly then I came in and we'd had an email in from a listener, and I thought, well, the listener's actually come up with a much better question than I ever could, which was, why didn't you take the job seriously? And actually, I sort of thought, well, if I can land that as a thought, did he take it seriously or not? Rather than, can I get a newsline out of this interview? That was the sort of the thing that I wanted to communicate.
It kind of struck me all the way through when you're listening to it, because you were putting that thought, felt to me like that was the overarching thought behind the interview. Were you serious in office? And I suppose there's always a sense when you've got a former, in this case Prime Minister, writing a book, a memoir, there's going to be a sense of them wanting to get their version of the record out there and, write their own history to some degree. And in this one, when you were putting that to him, what he kept coming back to is what he saw his successors in government as were the same things that we have heard time and time again: the vaccine and Ukraine. It kept coming back. The vaccine, look at these things that we've done that are serious. The vaccine
and saw Jeremy Corbyn. That's his 3 things.
Yes.
Corbyn, COVID,
which is the
Ukraine.
same that we heard, when he was in his sort of dying days in office and there was lots of question about his future and Partygate was in full swing, if you excuse the Partygate pun there. But, it was the same thing. It seems to me like that is what he is trying to say, that was the legacy of Boris Johnson.
Yeah. But the curiosity is that the truth in that also contributed to undermining his premiership, I think, in addition to his own decisions, because he had a platform, didn't he, in 2019, which was beat Jeremy Corbyn and get Brexit done. And actually the act of winning the election secured one of them. And then getting Brexit over the line so that the UK was legally outside of the European Union happened pretty quickly too. And then kind of what you're left with. And it was interesting, actually, on that point, that the first answer, I think it was, he latched onto the quote-unquote levelling up project, didn't he? As a kind of defining mission for him, not just then, but in his view, it still should be now.
Newscast from the BBC.